Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is a baby Hemi. If you've been following the channel for a while, then you probably already know that I've shown a good few of these early Hemis in videos before. First, I had this 315. Or was it this 315? I don't know. They're both blown up. They've both lived very long, very hard lives. They were both industrial or truck engines, and neither is really worth saving at all. I've also had the entire pile of 315 stuff listed for sale for like $500 for almost a year. No one wants these things. Most recently, I did a video on this, a 1953 or 54 DeSoto 276 Hemi. I got this thing running after it had been sitting for years and years, slightly full of water, slightly seized. It needs a lot of work now, but at least it ran. I still haven't brought it home for some reason. But last year, I also bought a 1955 Imperial sedan with a 331 Chrysler Hemi under the hood. If you're keeping score at home, that's 4 early Hemi engines. Well, now there's this, for a total of 5. There's also most of a 426 around here somewhere, but that's this whole other thing. Just over a week ago now, I responded to the ad for the DeSoto 276 Hemi. The gentleman was very friendly, and he informed me that he also had a Dodge Red Ram engine in pieces. Naturally, I was excited, so I took some extra money with me. This engine turns out to be a first-year 1953 Dodge 241, and I think that's neat. Now again, at this point, I've shared most of the important notes on the history of the Hemis in previous videos, particularly in the recent DeSoto video. If you're curious about that, go check out the 276 video that I did like a week before this one. The important historical note here is that Dodge did not get their Hemi V8, the Red Ram, until 1953, and then in 1955 it was enlarged to 270. That makes this a 2-year engine. I know this is a 53 engine because the engine number there, as you can maybe see, starts with D44. There are actually a few different engine codes used in 53 by Dodge, and I don't know why that is, but D44 is definitely a 53 engine. There are also casting number lists available, so we could roughly kind of sort of date every one of these components if we needed to. I'm fairly certain all of this is factory equipment, with the possible exception of the valve covers. Actually, I think these are the original correct covers with the embossed Red Ram and Dodge details. They should have been silver. The entire engine should have been silver. And they should have had little female thread nut things sticking up here that mount the plug wire covers. Someone has taken some artistic liberties with these. They certainly look nicer than the ones I had, so I can't complain too much. You might have already noticed that I just kind of threw this engine together for a photo op. It's missing some really important stuff. We're gonna go over all of that. And by the end of this video, I hope to figure out if this is an actual buildable early Hemi, or if it's another pile of scrap. So, what makes this a baby Hemi? Well, the fact that it's small, at least for a Hemi anyway. Of course, it has dual rocker shafts, big gigantic valve covers, super wide heads, and just generally looks imposing like all Hemi engines do. But compared to the Chrysler and DeSoto engines, this one is distinctly diminutive. Here's one of the Red Ram valve covers next to the DeSoto to show you what I mean. It's obviously shorter. It's about an inch shorter. But it's actually smaller in every dimension. Notice it's about, 3/4 of an inch skinnier in this direction. And it's not as tall as the DeSoto cover either. But it goes way farther than that. All of the components on this engine are sized accordingly to that smaller engine block. The rocker shafts, they're closer together, and the stands are closer together this way. The valves are closer together, the head bolts are spaced more closely, etc. Only the 241 and the 270 were made in this engine block size. Note where the deck surface is in relation to that water port. The larger Dodge engines were 315 and 325 cubic inches. And for these blocks, they extended the deck height and extended the stroke on the crank. Note something like an extra inch of material above the water port there. In addition to being tiny, there's actually something else unique about these early blocks too. Unlike the Chrysler and DeSoto, which had bolt bosses, mounting ears for engine mounts here on the side, these engines used the earlier floating power type mount suspended at the front of the water pump housing. We're looking at it upside down here, but anyway, it's this. Note the rubber isolator there in the middle. This wishbone looking thing mounts to the frame of the car and then holds that rubber piece at the top. For the tall deck Dodge engine, they finally rectified this situation and added on those bolt bosses. These can be mounted just like the other early Hemi engines. Someone out there might find this information useful. Essentially, those mounting ears are the same as were found on later Poly and LA engines. That's really helpful if you want to stick one of these where it doesn't belong. which I kind of do, but I'm getting ahead of myself. When Chrysler raised the deck height of the 354 block to create the 392, they did an interesting trick and rearranged the intake mounting pads so that the same intake manifolds would work between early short deck and late tall deck engines. Dodge did not do that. On the Dodge engine, the heads are essentially the same, tall deck and short deck. There are definitely different casting numbers over the years, and I'm sure there are important differences there, but tall deck to short deck is not necessarily different. What they did instead is change the intake manifold on these engines, so you've got your narrow short deck intake, and then you've got your wide tall deck intake. Incidentally, Chrysler would use this same trick again later on. When they expanded the B engine to the tall deck RB engine, they widened the intake manifold in exactly the same way. Here's the tall deck 315 intake in front of the 241 intake. It doesn't look like that big of a difference until you set this one on the 241 engine. Yeah, that ain't gonna work. Obviously, these are both two-barrel manifolds. This is a typical car manifold. This was used on a heavy-duty truck application. Doesn't really matter all of that much. This thing had a governor, but you could pull those long studs out and put a typical two-barrel on there instead. Other than the 331 in my Imperial, which does have a first-year 1955 four-barrel, all of my early Hemi stuff is two-barrel. Probably going to be sending hotheads some money for an intake at some point in the near future. For the DeSoto engine, for this little guy, we've got something else cool, and I'll show you that in a bit. The water pump housings are different between short and tall deck blocks for the same reason. These ports stayed in the same place, but these ones moved that direction. Here's the tall deck pump. The exhaust manifolds are the same basic design, the same bolt pattern, etc. The 241 actually came with good ones, which is great. The 315 manifolds that I have are not so nice. Also, they're full of mud. A lot of this engine's full of mud, actually. Here's a layout of the cylinder heads, the rockers, and the exhaust manifolds from the two Dodge engines. Again, while they are not the same, they are essentially interchangeable. You can see the heads are the same height, the ports are the same layout. There are little differences. These heads have dual valve springs, while these have singles. These have rotators on the exhaust side, these don't. This is a very, very late 1959? It's a late enough production head that people don't think it exists, but it does. These were used in heavy-duty applications, and they were actually still in production well after the Hemis had left cars. For reasons that aren't quite worth explaining, it's now the next day, and we're continuing our archaeological dig into the baby Hemi. Next item on the list is this, the crankcase breather / valley pan assembly. I've stated in previous videos that if you've got an early Hemi with one of these on it, it's full of chunks. And this one is no exception. This is the breather opening that goes down into the crankcase. And this is where the road draft tube attaches. This is at the back of the engine. It uses a single bolt to hold it in place. It points off that way behind the passenger valve cover toward the road. Essentially, the science behind that is a low pressure area underneath the car draws vapors out of that tube and helps to evacuate gases. Back in the days of cars like this, a road draft tube was typical. Also typical, an oily streak of nightmares in the middle of every highway lane in America. There's a reason they did away with these things. Of course, the road draft tube would eventually give way to these early emissions systems. The PCV, positive crankcase ventilation, which sends those vapors into the carburetor to be burned by the engine, and a breather that expels its gases into the air cleaner, performing a similar job. Before we go any further on engine components, I do have to circle back to the cylinder head. I feel like I skipped some important things here. First, we can take a look at the Hemi chamber in the 241 head. Note, it's tiny. Valve sizes. The 315 head actually has a much larger intake valve. It appears to measure about 1 3/4 inches, while the 241 intake valve is about 1 5/8 inches or so. It appears that the exhaust valves are the same size at 1 3/8 inches, which is good. As mentioned, these have a burned valve, and if I want to use these heads, I'm going to have to address that. Unlike later poly and small block engines, these use a tin timing cover. It's a lot like a small block Chevy, but it does have a fuel pump mount on it. This one is absolutely disgusting. This is the oil pan that came with the 241. It's a car pan, and it does happen to have clearance at the back here that might accommodate, say, A-body steering linkage. It might be too deep, though. The front is similar to the later small block pan shape, but again, it's deeper, so this may require extensive modification. Also, it has some holes in it. Really, though, there seems to be a lot of that going around. Here's the oil pump and pickup that matches that pan. Note, this is actually a floating pickup design, which is really clever. They did away with this in later years because it cost too much money, I'm sure. The oil pump is very, very similar to the later ALA pump. It does use a different flathead drive. This one is seized, so I guess it's not a good donor for the DeSoto. The design of the camshaft on the 241 is weird. I believe the 315 has a more conventional setup, but this thing has a big long snout with a threaded section. It has multiple pieces that attach to the front. This is some kind of retaining plate, I think. This is, of course, the cam plate that secures the cam into the block. And this is the fuel pump eccentric. Instead of a sheet metal piece like A's and LA's use, it's a big, gigantic cast piece that slides on there. When I first saw this, I thought the cam was broken. You'll have to forgive me for bouncing around between various things. First off, I've taken really long breaks in the middle of filming this video and I have no idea where I was. Also though, it's all just kind of piled in totes, so I'm going through things as I find them. For example, here's the oil pump drive. Of course, I did show one just like this in the DeSoto video. Here's a lineup of some different rod and piston assemblies. On the left is our 241. These engines have a teeny tiny bore at 3.43 inches, I believe. It's very small. Note, there's no indent on the side of this piston as is commonly seen on later ones. And also, there's a hole. I think that's an oil return passageway. I've never seen anything like that. The rings are pretty well stuck in this. That oil control ring is a really interesting design. Coming over to the 315 here from just a few years later, things look a lot more normal and modern. Obviously, there's this flat area on the skirt. There's a conventional looking pack of rings, and it is much larger. Also note, these pistons have been knurled. I've lined the wrist pins up as closely as I can. Tops of the pistons, yeah, that seems right. And you can see the difference in rod length right there. Interestingly, the rod journal on the 315 crank is much larger as well. Compare that to this. This is an LA 360 rod and piston assembly. Very, very similar. Obviously a good bit more beef there. I don't know if these use the same rod journal or not. I believe they're different. I know the main journals in the 315 are the same as a small block Chrysler, but I think the rod bearings are a slightly different size. Obviously, the 315 piston is a little teeny tiny guy compared to our 360 piston here. This belongs to another engine we'll be building on the channel very soon, I hope. I haven't scrutinized the factory 241 pistons very closely, but for some reason this engine came with a spare set as well. I don't know what these are. I do know they are missing that extra hole, otherwise they look very similar. These don't fit in the bores. There's a number on there, and I could probably look that up and figure out what the heck it is. I'm assuming he was planning to bore this block to fit these, and there's probably a reason for that. I am seeing scuff marks on several of these factory pistons. Corrosion. I haven't found anything broken or majorly damaged yet. All of the rings are stuck. There's going to be some work involved in fixing that. Hey, there's the draft tube. Very nice. That's an inspection cover. And that is a clutch fork. However, I happen to know that this thing was not in front of a conventional manual transmission. Notice this little electrical gizmo with some wires leading up to the carburetor and the coil. This was in front of one of those fancy semi-automatic transmissions. What the heck do they call those? Fluid drive? I guess I have to take a moment to explain that fluid drive was not the transmission itself. That was the fluid coupling in front of a conventional clutch and manual transmission. And then there was another version, the version I'm talking about here, that had a semi-automatic transmission behind it. There were several different versions of fluid drive, and I didn't really do a great job of explaining any of them here. So the important note is this, the safety clutch. These cars would still have a clutch pedal, but because they had that fluid coupling in front of the clutch, you essentially did not need to use this. It could be used for safety to make absolutely sure the vehicle wouldn't creep or move in any way. In early versions of the fluid drive, you would still use the clutch to shift gears or ranges in the transmission. The coupling would simply make taking off from a stop much easier. This system is an ignition interrupt. Essentially what it would do is when you floor the throttle, it would kill the ignition briefly to allow the transmission enough time to kick down a gear. Once it shifted, it would power the ignition up again and away you would go. The only vehicle with one of these in place I've ever driven was Evan at Rocket's Chrysler Traveler. That one wouldn't shift gears. So I've yet to see one that actually works. I showed you one of my 315 floating power mounts. Even though the 315 has the ears on the side of the block, for some reason they continue to use these in various applications. Anyway, this is the one for the 241, and it's very broken. Looking at the state all of these pistons are in, I have to assume this engine was seized at some point too. That's just really gummy and nasty. Most of these pistons, again, are looking fine, but I have noticed A lot of the rod caps are just not here. Are they in the parts pile? I don't know. Are they numbered so I can figure out which one went where? I don't think so. Look at this rod bearing. It's tiny. Here's a look at the crankshaft and the matching teeny tiny rod journals. Just adorable. While we're looking at this crank, I can show you this. This is the early Hemi crank flange. Similar flanges were found on early big block Chrysler engines starting in 1958 and on the Poly until 1961, I believe. I said that wrong. You better get used to that. It's through 1961. 1962 is when the aluminum torque flight came and the flange was changed. The flange is much longer than the later ones, and there are 8 bolt holes which are not threaded. This is because the 8 bolts that secured this crank to either a flywheel or a torque converter were installed from this direction. There are no threads here. They would have been in whatever the bolts were going into. And the flange had to be extended off the back of the engine to make room to roll those bolts in. Starting in 1962, Chrysler used a flex plate in front of the aluminum torque flights and a conventional flywheel that did not have threads in it, and those items would be bolted to the later 6-bolt cranks. 426 Hemis have an 8-bolt crank much like this, but the holes are threaded. Apparently the pattern is the same though. Distributors. Very similar to what was used in Poly and LAs. I don't think the length is exactly the same, but I do think there's a way to make this and an LA oil pump work in these engines. This is actually a dual point distributor, which is really interesting to see in a low power engine like this. Speaking of low power, I never have mentioned that through this entire video for some reason. The 241 was rated for 140. Compare that to the DeSoto 276 rated at 160. Obviously, as with all other early Hemis, this engine has a whole lot more potential than that. I have to point this out because this has happened to me multiple times. Somebody lost the clip out of this Autolite rotor. There should be a flat piece of metal in there. Actually, it's like L-shaped. It's round, it fits in the top, and then it's flat on the side here. And that locks it into the distributor. Without that clip, no worky. Spark plug tubes are an essential part of any Hemi. Because the spark plugs are in roughly the middle of the valve cover, these tubes are used to seal around the plug and seal around the cover where everything goes through. You insert the plug down in there, thread it into the hole, and then you have a special long dingus end plug wire that goes in and clicks onto it. I've got 2 good ones. The rest look like this. Good Lord, people. Anyway. Other than the tubes, you also have to have the special head bolts. I think we're missing one. Unless it's in the hardware bin or in here somewhere, the rockers had all but one sitting in them. Also push rods. These are 2 different lengths, intake and exhaust. The exhaust ones are the long ones. They have to reach across the head to actuate the arm for the exhaust valve. I have 7 of each for a total of 14. These 2 are going to be low deck Dodge specific. I'm sure these are available somewhere. Hotheads probably has them. And you could order them. It is important to note that they have little teeny tiny 1/4-inch balls on both ends. The dipstick tube goes into the side of the block and it's totally broken and destroyed. I think I saw the other half of it in this bucket. Maybe it could be fixed or used as a pattern. And now we're looking at the block itself. And there's some interesting details to note here. First, the cam tunnel is enclosed, just like the short deck DeSoto was. The cam tunnels were opened up on top on all of the late tall deck blocks. I don't know why they did this, but I do know that that detail survived into the B engine and the A-series Poly engine, and the LA, of course, by extension. Oh, I actually forgot to show you the hydraulic lifters. This is really interesting because compared to the DeSoto engine I worked on last week, they're very different. These just look like a typical lifter. The DeSoto has a spring and a piston sticking out the top of it. It's like that tall. One has to wonder if there's a similar height between the push rods for this engine and that engine due to the weird lifter design. It's a moot point because I need all the ones for the DeSoto anyway. On this engine, it's at least possible to get the lifter in like this, but there's a hole provided on the deck surface where you can simply pass it through. Here's what that deck surface looks like. It is so small for an American V8. And look at that bore size. Obviously, the way this is spaced, they left room to grow in there. This block in tall deck form would ultimately reach 325 cubic inches. It is interesting to note that the tall deck block is supplemented with an extra hole next to that lifter hole. I'm assuming that's due to a slightly different pushrod angle, given that the head was moved up and outward slightly. Again, as near as I can tell, the rockers between the two are exactly the same, and that's good because if I want to build this 241, those rockers look like they were on the Titanic. These off of my 315 kind of look okay, and some of them even move. I do have to wonder how thick the cylinder walls are in these blocks. As I understand, core shift was a pretty serious issue with these early castings, and there may not be as much meat back there as you would expect. I rolled the block over so we could take a look at the underside, and stuff came raining out. That's special. Anyway, here's a look at the bottom end. Main caps. Very much like a small block Chrysler. If you've seen the underside of one of those, you've pretty much seen the underside of one of these. Although again, the block is shorter. Something like 2 inches shorter if I remember right. Here's the 318 main bearing alongside the 241 main bearing. They are actually slightly larger. I seem to recall reading that these are the same as the 315 main bearings, at least in size. Maybe I read wrong, I don't know. Notice the drilled holes here and here. Those are the oil drain backs for the cylinder heads. Because they're so humongously wide, there's really no way to run it back into the valley the way the small block and the big block heads do. So these drain holes are necessary to get oil back from the head to the pan. If they ever get clogged, you're gonna have a bad time. The poly head uses similar drain back holes. Years ago, I had to replace a head gasket, broken valve spring, and some other top end pieces on a 318 poly in my 61 Dodge flatbed. When I removed the head, it was covered in horrible, scungy nightmare stuff. And the oil drain back hole into the block was clogged solid. I think I ended up running a screwdriver through it or something and cleaning it out as best I can. I'm not sure it was effective because that engine always had a smoking problem. Just a refresher, or in case you don't know, the bolt pattern for the bell housing on the early Hemi engines is almost exactly the same as the A series and the LA series. The dowel pins are in a slightly different location, and actually on the Hemi, that hole is threaded. On the A series engine, that bolt comes in from the other direction, but that wasn't possible here because of the oil filter mounting. Aside from that, it's very, very similar. With a small spacer adapter that's sold by Hotheads, which changes the location of the dowels and fixes the little bolting issue, you can use an LA transmission behind one of these, no problem. That's all of the useful details I can think of off the top of my head, so now it's time to answer the most important question. Is this a viable candidate? Well, that kind of depends on your perspective. Me, I was hoping I could just throw this together with the pieces that came with it and some of my random leftovers from the other engines. That's not going to happen. If whoever disassembled this thing had been a little more careful with, say, rod caps and hardware, and rod bearings, keeping all that stuff straight, we might have more of a shot here. Obviously, these rings would have to be unstuck if I were to use these pistons. That's a job, for sure. Judging by how clean the bores are, these have already been at least lightly honed. Yeah, there's some surface rust, that's from moisture. Any nice clean bare metal like that is going to rust. We could probably hone this again and it would look pretty good. I'm sure you can see the little shadow of a ridge there. If we had pistons and rings of an appropriate size and a usable condition, with a hone job, those bores would be just fine, I think. The better of my 315 blocks had a horrible freeze crack all the way down the side of it, which was like brazed back together. It looks really bad. I don't see anything like that on this engine. This block is just dirty. None of the gaskets are here. On the DeSoto, I at least had crappy gaskets for everything but valve covers to piece back together with some silicone. Nope, gotta get a gasket set. And if you're gonna make that sort of investment, why don't you just have the block sent to the machine shop and do everything right? I'm sure that's what this person was going to do. I could certainly either clean these heads up and replace the one valve, or potentially clean up the 315 heads and use those instead. Again, these heads are no spring chickens either, but it's an option. The cam bearings actually aren't as bad as I expected. They're not exactly pretty. This is kind of cool. The galley ends are O-ringed to the backside of that cam plate. They did away with that in later blocks. Oh, that's what's falling out of the block. Okay. A critter was storing snacks in there. I was really hoping the main bearings were going to be the same as LA engines because I have a ton of factory size main bearings for those. Also, I don't know if you noticed this, but that is the number 3 main cap with the upper thrust surface. It's supposed to be back there. Everything that was inside this engine looks like this. And everything that was outside it looks like this. I absolutely love putting engines together with random used leftovers that you just kind of clean up and breathe on. You know, bubblegum and popsicle sticks, farm style rebuild. That's exactly what I'm doing with my 318 Poly currently, and I hope to have an update on that for you very soon. Hey, the block's actually inside now, and it's being used as a table. There is just not enough here to work with, which is unfortunate. Now, that does not mean this 241 is scrap metal or a lost cause or anything. You see, the good news is that Hotheads exists. At least I think they exist. I can't get to their website right now. Stupid ancient Windows 7 computer. Everything's fine. Anyway, they've got all of the things for rebuilding these early Hemis, and if one were to pony up enough scratch, they'd probably send everything necessary to make this 241 fresh again. Gaskets, pistons, hopefully, etc. But I just can't even think about that right now. For one thing, I'm rebuilding that Hemi, and I've got 2 other running first-generation engines to feed. Yeah, if I was going to send Hotheads a ton of money right now, it would be for DeSoto gaskets. So unfortunately, this 241 engine's going to sit in the corner for the next forever. Unless somebody wants to buy 2.5 Dodge Hemis, I'll make you a great deal. But you have to take all of it. Act now and I'll include this box of really cool hot rod stuff I almost forgot to show you. This actually does not come from Hotheads, it comes from Hell's Gate Hot Rods. This kit was ordered in 2012, which gives you an idea of how long this engine's been sitting in pieces, but that company is still in business and they're still selling kits just like this one. Say you don't want to run a factory 2-barrel on your 241 Dodge Hemi. You want to run something cool and hot rod styled. Well, they sell this kit. And it is a kit. You can get these assembled, but it's much cheaper if you buy just the basic pieces. The kit consists of pretty good sized flanges, intermediate tubes, large tubes and caps that are hiding somewhere in here, then some smaller tubes, and finally, the topper, Stromberg carb flanges. It's kind of crazy looking. They make these kits for all sorts of other engines as well. This is some sort of General Motors product, or maybe a Studebaker. It's hard to tell, they're basically the same thing. Anyway, as you can see, the large tube forms a common plenum, and then the carburetors sit on top. This particular kit appears to have 6 of them, and there actually are 6 Stromberg flanges in here, but you could choose to do 4 or 6, I suppose. Also in this box, a set of bare header flanges. They did not include any pipes or anything like that, but you could use these to make super cool lake-style headers or zoomies, or you could hack up a set of small Walker big block headers and made them to these flanges with some modifications. The choices are endless. First-generation Hemis are cool. They're beautiful. They have a presence like nothing else. They are the perfect nostalgic hot rod engine, especially for something that doesn't have a hood, so you can see it. And they're great for old school drag racing type operations too, although obviously they're better with a blower on top. I love these engines. This one, not going together anytime soon. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed taking a look at it, and hopefully you got some kind of useful information out of this video. I do have to offer a quick thank you to all of my channel members. You guys are the best. You help support me financially and make sure that I can go out and make terrible decisions like buying old Hemis in pieces. So again, thank you. Member or not, thank you very much for watching. And remember, if you can't dodge it, red ram it.